O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be describing On Description, a paper featured in The Map is Indestructible, and the paper is going to be arguing that there's this kind of interesting dilemma that when we describe something, we're trying to describe it, what the thing is, and yet description is always an act of thinking, which means it's inseparable from subjectivity. So when we describe something, say in writing, painting, speaking, it's always an act of thinking about a perception, and there's a paper in Reconstructing A&A on thinking and perceiving, and this can be found on Medium and Substack as well. When I look at a window and I stop thinking, I just look at it. I'm perceiving the window. But then when I start thinking, I say, oh, that's a window. Well, now I'm thinking about the window, and my thought consumes the perception. And so it's funny because when we describe something, we're trying to describe often a perception, but we have to do it through thought. Description is an act of thinking. When you speak to someone, when you put in a novel. And so there's kind of a paradox here because what you're trying to do is put a perception into thought. And ultimately, this cannot be done perfectly. Now, that doesn't mean the description is inaccurate or it has nothing to do with the thing that you're describing, but it does mean that there's always going to be some influence of thought. And to the degree we deny this or we don't realize it's occurring, the more we might find ourselves describing the world aligned with an ideological bubble or using description in service of ideology. The Map is Indestructible is going to talk a lot about how we're always creating maps, ways to guide ourselves, ways to understand the world, which is very akin and aligned with ideology, but it's hard to use the word ideology now and not have the term really aligned with politics and Marxist thought and different things like this. But basically what we want to say is that if we're not careful, we might think we're engaging in just describing what the thing is, but really we are making it toward a certain ideological vision. So, for example, if you have a conservative who says the anti-American march on Washington was against gun rights, well, you as a conservative might find liberalism anti-American. You just like describing liberalism. It's anti-American. But really the term anti-American has a judgment part of it. And you're also saying that being against gun rights is anti-American. So there's a certain ideological framing that's in play within that description. So likewise, if you say a mob descended on DC, well, the moment you call a group a mob, that's suggesting that there's something bad. Similarly, something that we see a lot now is like if conservatives are describing what liberals are doing, and we say liberals are compelled by wokeism, for example. Well, that may not capture the subjective experience of liberals of their own actions or their own motives for what they do. Wokeism is often used as a term that's kind of negative. It's usually a negative term that you're using. And when you say that liberals are motivated by wokeism, that might be what they're motivated to you as a conservative, but it may not really capture what the liberal subjectively experiences themselves motivated by. And you see, the problem is then if a liberal, say, were to read that conservative paper or essay, they would automatically go, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, or this girl doesn't know what she's talking about, because the description relative to them would be objectively wrong. It is not objectively the case that they're motivated by wokeism, and so then they would be able to disregard the document, and maybe the document has some great lessons in it, but because the descriptions are careless or not careful, they send signals on who the paper is for, who the essay is for, and who it is not. So it's always really important to realize that description cannot avoid, or description can be in service of ideology. Now, how do we get around this? Well, perhaps we can never perfectly get around of it, but if we do our best in our description to describe the phenomenology of the group or the people that we are describing, how they experience the world, a very empathetic act, that might go a long way to helping curb some of the orientations or ways that descriptions are in service of ideology. Sometimes in description we can try to avoid subjectivity to get, quote unquote, at things as they really are. But actually, it might be better to embrace subjectivity and just try to describe phenomenologically what is going on as opposed to try to get around it. So there's a kind of irony here where it can be better to embrace a description, a phenomenological description of an individual as opposed to not doing so. And I also think, frankly, that one of the great things that art can do in general is describe people's first-person voice, the little voice in their head that is the narrative, the source of narrative for their lives. The novel, one of the things a novel can do that the painting can't do, and actually I think movies can't do very well because the voiceover is not very good, is describe the inner structure of thought, the inner rationality, the way the mind interprets and understands situations. And we live as humans constantly having that voice in our head. Now, I know there's a rare number of people who have no inner voice at all, but a lot of us have that inner voice. And if you don't include a description of that inner voice when you're describing a character or you're describing people, you're trying to understand people, arguably you're leaving out a massive part of what makes them who they are. And so if we don't describe subjectivity, because say we think that subjectivity isn't real or we just don't think about it, then we're actually arguably going to be leaving out, in the name of realism, we might be leaving out the description necessary for realism, for getting at reality. So I think descriptions of phenomenology, of subjectivity, and the way that the subject experiences his or herself is really, really important. And then also an awareness of how descriptions have ideological charges can also help us avoid some of the pitfalls of falling into ideology and not realizing it. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so forth and so on. Please see Amazon and the books there. All purchases and reviews are greatly appreciated. And thank you so much for your time.